All right, welcome to another Indie Comic Exchange interview. I think this is number 15. Jake and I are being joined this fine Sunday morning with the ever patient Tony Figueroa and Wrestler Zero. Tony, how are you doing this morning?
I'm doing pretty good, brother. How are you?
Oh, great, great. I mean, other than some technical issues on maintaining my credibility as
Sure.
a podcaster, um, we'll see how it comes about. But yeah, hey, why don't you just go ahead and start sharing with us how you got into comics and how you make your comics?
Oh boy. Well, first off, let's talk face to face, shall we? So let me take this off, and there I am in all of
All
my
right.
barefaced glory.
Hey.
Yes, I get my hair cut this way.
That's great. That's great.
Well, how do I get in? How did I get into comics? Well, um, I comics were always around. When I was a kid, it was much more of a mass medium, meaning it was much more ubiquitous. It was available in drugstores. It was available anywhere where parents went
Yeah.
shopping, for the family and stuff. They could pick up some comics for the kids. So that's how I got started. And I think I was about 5 or 6 years old, and my mom handed me an issue of Iron Man, and I was never the same after that.
Ooh.
My mind was just blown off the hinges, and it just gets into your DNA. It kind of rewrites your brain chemistry, and for that point, I was a comic book addict for life.
Oh yeah. Mine was
So,
Conan.
how much was the
The first, yeah,
yeah? How much was the comic cover price at that time?
at the risk of revealing how ancient I am, it was I think it was like 20 cents, maybe, or 15 cents. It was like the
That
21st.
was
Same age.
Yeah, it was the 21st.
yeah.
Yeah, it was the 21st issue of Iron Man. It was written by the late great Archie Goodwin and drawn by George Tuska and inked by EC great Johnny Craig. And it was a
Right.
two-part story. I didn't get to read the second part of that story until I was well into my teenage years. So I was in suspense for a little over a decade as to how that story ended. But I
Right.
just read every comic book I can get my hands on to this day still.
Yeah. It's the same with me with the 20-cent marbles. That's when I was that perfect age, and Iron Man had the primary colors
Hmm.
too. You had the yellow and the red, and it just gets into you deep, and when you see those covers today, it's just like, wow, that's great. And then you look inside and it's like, oh, George Tuska, he's good, but it's not my favorite. And then it doesn't matter. Like, it's the
Hmm.
cover, it's the era, the memories, they come flooding back.
Oh, it comes. Yeah.
So good
I
stuff.
actually have not the same copy, but I have a copy of that first comic, along with the second part of the story. And you smell that paper, and it's like Bern Hogarth
Right.
called
Yeah.
it the fatal perfume. It just gets into you. But as far as George
Mm.
Tuska goes, just since you touched upon him briefly, when you're that age, you don't really. I didn't start reading the credit boxes until I started, getting more serious about drawing. And George Tuska I think, is a really good artist. First off, he draws terrific hands. If you ever need to, swipe
Hmm.
hands, get a George Tuska comic. He's just great with hands. And a lot of his bad guys had what a friend of mine calls a George Tuska overbite. You know,
Yeah.
Terrific artist. Solid
Right.
storyteller, and that's really what it's all about in the end. And I think what I liked about Iron Man was that he was vulnerable. Because he relied on that armor to keep himself alive, and when it started to lose power
Yeah.
or whatever, he was in a pretty tough spot. So, yeah.
Yeah. I love Tuska's run. I think the greatest work Tuska ever did was probably the Luke Cage Hero for Hire
Hmm.
Origins. You had that guard with that overbite and
Yeah.
everything. But he had good runs. He had good runs on
Hmm.
Hulk and Iron Man, and he was around. He did Avengers, so he was all pro. He was definitely one of
Hmm.
the best. But he wasn't like John Romita is like, oh wow, you get the book, you get the Spider-Man book, or the
Yeah.
coveted Fantastic Four. So there was always a pecking order, but George Tuska is definitely a
Well, you
classic.
know what? I'm glad you mentioned those early issues of Luke Cage Power Man, because he was inked by Billy Graham, who later took over the art chores. And Billy's just one of those guys. He's probably best known for Black Panther, the run he had with Don McGregor.
Yep.
But he was another
Yep.
fabulous artist you don't really hear enough about. But I think Tuska did that issue of the Hulk you were saying he was inked by Ernie Chan. It was Doc Samson versus the Rhino. Um,
Yep.
I'm really showing all my
What?
credentials here, you know.
Yeah.
Oh,
No,
that's
he
good.
he
The
was he
classics.
was there in the
The
early
classics,
days.
that's it. But I'll tell you, as long as we're talking about artists, the one guy whose work I noticed, even at an early age, that stood out from everyone else was Gil Kane on Green Lantern. His
Wow.
figure
Yeah.
work
Yep.
just didn't look like anyone else's, and he's definitely one of my favorites for that style, that, Marvel method of working and that whole look. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, Gil Kane. If I'm not wrong, he was around in the late
Hmm.
50s first, and you could see how his style emerged from those like earlier styles into his own style, and he became just this like as soon as you see it, you know it's him. Nobody else is like
Yeah,
him.
for sure.
There's like a real fluidity to the musculature, and he did great faces. I remember him when he was doing Spider-Man. He did the Gwen
Yeah,
Stacy Green Goblin
yes.
epic, and he was there on a lot of great
Mhm.
titles, mostly covers, I think, but Gil Kane internal pages is buy that book no matter what.
Absolutely. And, talking about Gil just for a moment here, uh, Gil was very heavily influenced by quality comics era Reed Crandall. He was doing Doll Man and Condor and The Ray. And
Right.
before that, there was another artist called Lou Fine who had that sort of graceful,
Hmm.
Yeah.
sleek figure work. And then I think he's also
Yep.
was influenced by Bern Hogarth's Tarzan work. And
Definitely,
Yep.
and even Bill
mhm,
Everett, and those guys that came
yeah,
before him. I think Gil Kane comes into the scene around the same time as Carmine
yeah,
Infantino, and just like completely different
mhm,
styles, but they worked on a lot of the
yeah,
same characters. They did a lot of back and forth. I mean, Carmine never came to Marvel, but they did a lot. But Gil Kane did a lot of back and forth for Marvel and DC. So he was one of my favorites too. I just put him down as one of my
so,
favorites. He didn't do too much for the X Men, but I know he did the
yeah,
cover for a lot of
yes,
X
he
Men,
did.
including X Men Giants
Yeah,
Number
inked
One.
by the
Hey,
late great Dave
Tony.
Cockrum. Yeah.
So, how does all this fit into you building Wrestler Zero?
How does what's the genesis of Wrestler Zero, so to speak? Well,
Well, how
I'm
is all
originally from
like
Brooklyn,
Gil
New York.
Kane and all of that?
How does it fit in? Well, gee, that's a good question. The secret origin of Wrestler Zero, if you will, is I have to give you
Oh,
some cultural context here. I'm originally from Brooklyn, New York. Uh, when I was a child, I lived in Puerto Rico for 4 years. And so, in order to learn Spanish, to be able to go to school, I had to be able to read Spanish language translations of Marvel and DC comics. I was able to get conversant enough with Spanish. And while I was living in Puerto Rico, I came across this comic. I don't know if you ever heard of El Santo.
yes.
He's
Yeah.
sort of like Hulk Hogan and Elvis Presley rolled into one. And this was a week, 3 times a week comic that was published featuring him. And it featured this technique, I don't know how well you can see it, called photo montage, where basically they would get Santo to do a photo shoot for most of the day in different poses. And then, backgrounds would be added in either with photos or paintings. And, so this was very widely available in Puerto Rico, and I was completely fascinated by it. I was a child. And then I started seeing this magazine that was an import from Mexico, Lucha Libre magazine.
Hmm.
And when you're a
Right.
kid, you don't know that wrestling is, worked. And so you think it's real, and you see these guys with these shiny masks and capes when you're a little kid, and it made such a profound impression on me. I was like, oh my God, because the best of them know how to blur that line between reality and fantasy with the way they carry themselves, their whole look, the aesthetic appeal of it. And man, they caught me hook, line, and sinker. So it just went from there. And then
And was this your first foray into comic
the
making?
comic you're looking at right now, Wrestler Zero, I was, I wanted to be a comic book artist for Marvel or DC. That would, I would have probably sold my soul when I was a teenager to achieve that. That never materialized. I ended up going into the military for 10 years instead to get the GI
Hmm.
Bill to pay for art school. Then I became a dad, so that like never happened. But I always drew. I was looking at stuff, and I started working with a gentleman who was publishing a match wrestler themed magazine called From Parts Unknown, and that's where I got my first work published. It was just some uh, very small illustrations to accompany articles. And that got me to thinking, I really want to do a comic. I've always wanted to do comics. Uh, so why don't I just create, something of my own? I'll self-publish it. I was reading a lot of Dave Sim. He's sort of like the godfather, one of the godfathers of comic book self-publishing. And I said,
Hmm.
I've got to try something. And at the time I did this comic, I was a single father and I was working a full-time job at the post office. So I was devoting my
Hmm.
Wow.
nights and, tons of coffee and, stuff like that to, produce
Hmm.
this comic. And I'll be perfectly candid with you. I had like no idea what I was doing. I'm trying to ink with
Hmm.
$5 brushes and it's not looking like Joe Sinnott.
Hmm.
But
Right. Well, you got a great look
thanks,
there.
I agree.
We'll get into the aesthetics
well,
a
thanks.
little later, but so this was just kind of like a labor of love done in the cracks
Yes.
of life, and all the responsibilities, and keeping your childhood dreams in mind, even if it's on the back burner. And then when did it all finally come together and get
What
published?
happened was when I finished, the pages, it's all hand lettered, hand drawn. Um, I took it down to a Kinko's with the original art in order, page order, and I made copies of each page and I stapled it together to look like a comic. And I handed it to the person across the counter. I said, "Can I get 300 of these?" And
Hmm.
about a week
Oh, wow.
later, pick, about a week later, I get this box. I go down there, I pick it up, and it's got 300 issues of Wrestler Zero #1. Uh, and I was thrilled to death, to be perfectly candid with you. I because it became real at that moment, if you know what I mean. Because when you
Yeah.
do this kind of work, it's very labor intensive. You tend to work in a vacuum, especially if you're working by yourself. And when you finally have the finished product printed in your hand, that's it. It's real. That's something you can give someone and say, "Hey, I did this." Hmm.
Right.
Yeah, it's a huge,
Yeah,
huge thing,
but it's
man.
not just a prototype. You have enough for as many as you can sell, right? So it's not just like the one
Right.
original copy. It's mass produced
Exactly.
here. Right. So you went straight into Kinko's. Was there thought given to the paper selection and the size, or was it just like trying to do what's economical?
Uh, D, a little bit of the above. Uh,
Right.
Basically, yes, it was definitely a matter of economics. There's no two ways about it. Secondly, I like the mini comic format. I do want to graduate to the regular sized comic that we're all accustomed to. And I also, you have to have this balancing act when you're a creative person. You have to believe in yourself enough to put your work out there and to face potential rejection and criticism, while at the same time maintaining an awareness that you have a long way to go and there's much to learn. And so I figured I would start this way, kind of in this small way. And as I hopefully got better in the craft aspect of it, I could finally, graduate to a full size comic, if you will, maybe even in color. But I do like the black and white aesthetic as well.
Yeah.
Because I grew up watching black and white TV shows like The Outer Limits and Twilight Zones, a lot of classic horror films that were in black and white. And I think that monochromatic look has a certain beauty to it. But I like
Yeah.
color just as much as everyone else does too. But it was kind of prohibitive to print in color at that point for me,
Right.
and I don't think I had the tools. I color my work with acrylic ink, and I didn't have that at the time.
Hmm.
So I had just had to do a comic. It was just as simple as that.
Yeah. All right. So take us into the world here. of the Wrestler
Mhm.
Zero. Um, what's going on? How is it different?
Mhm.
What could people expect?
Well, I'm not sure if you're familiar with the mass wrestler films from Mexico. Like when they were brought to the United States, it was called Samson versus the Vampire Women and Samson versus the Zombies. But those
Yes,
are El Santo
yes.
films. Yeah. And it's very golden age level characterization. Santo was a hero. Uh, if there's a weird menace in the Mexican countryside, something the authorities can't handle, they call in Santo. He takes care of it. Then he, goes back to what he was doing. And I wanted to have a little bit more characterization than that. And so all hero origins have that element of life and death, right? Or death and rebirth, I should say, excuse me, whether it's literal or symbolic. Like, for instance, Batman, there's definitely death and rebirth there. And, parents, Bruce Wayne's parents are murdered. I think he also dies along with them and becomes this proto Batman. That's symbolic. Same thing with
Hmm.
Peter Parker. Any kind of heroic origin usually has some moment where one life ends and another one begins. And so I wanted to bring that into Wrestler Zero. So I came up with the idea of having him murdered uh, by an unknown assassin, and that will all be revealed subsequently. And that suspended moment between life and death, time doesn't have any meaning. So he discovers in this death-like state that there's this sort of quiet war going on between forces of darkness and forces of order, and he gets sort of
Hmm.
recruited into this and restored to life. So
Okay, so has he got some kind of like supernatural powers or some otherworldly
the only
superpowers or something? Or is he just like a ass kicking
well,
wrestler?
the tagline I said is keen intellect and amazing vitality, but if as far as the power goes, he has the ability to sort of see into the darkness, for a lack of a better term. He can tune his mind into um, when there's supernatural activity, he can kind of tune his mind to a higher pitch, I call it, and sort of be able to see
Uh-huh.
beyond the five senses and say, hey, I'm getting glimpses of something. And I'll tell you where this comes from. I was very influenced by this TV show in the 90s called Millennium. It was created
Hmm.
by Chris Carter, the guy who does X Files, and the protagonist was this guy called Frank Black. And he's sort of like a detective, but he sort of has a similar ability where he gets these flashes, they're very quick, of some evil that's uh, out of the ordinary, let's say. And I said, that's a great idea. I don't want to just take it cold. I want to kind of add my own interpretation to it. And that's what I came up with. So, because I wanted to, yeah, because,
Okay.
one of the things with a hero is the hero has to have a certain amount of personal involvement. It can't be just detached, like I'm here to solve your problems and to mind your business, and then I'm going to go on my merry way when I've taken care of business. I felt like he had to have yeah, he had to have like a personal connection to what was going on. And what's more personal than being able to see with your own eyes and feel, the weirdness of these menaces. So that's where that came from.
Right. Yeah. It's so it sounds like you have this character mapped out, and there's this this otherworldly dimension of good versus evil in there. So that's like good conceptual stuff. It's like a
Thanks.
world. Um,
Tony, what are you doing to promote?
Well, I'm going to be perfectly candid with you. I'm a little new with the self promotion business. I have a very small YouTube channel. I'm hoping to grow it. I have my Instagram and my Facebook and my X, Twitter. Uh, but right now, I'm working on new material so I can have actually something to promote. Um, I think one of the traps that's easy to fall into, and this is something I have fallen into as well, is the unconscious hope or expectation that someone is going to come along and recognize what you're doing and say, "Hey,
Very good
I'm going
point.
to put some money." Or yeah, it's like you've probably heard the story, the famous starlet that was discovered sitting at a lunch counter, but she was so beautiful. Producer walked in
Yes.
and saw her and said, "Hey, we as creative people, and it's regardless of what kind of creative work you're doing, you can't sit back and wait to be discovered. you have to get out there and make yourself known. And that's something I've struggled with. I'm not the world's most natural self-promoter,
We all do.
but as you were saying, yeah. But as we were saying, we were talking before we started our interview here, and we're all learning this as we go. So I've definitely gotten more interested in promoting my work and putting myself out there. And that's why I try to be very attentive with my social media, uh, and get the word out that way.
Well, that's how I
So we'll see
found
how that
you,
goes.
was on Instagram.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think I was aware of you from before because I had seen like a lot of you were doing like short inking demos, Kurt. And you were
Yes.
putting some stuff out there, and I said, man, I like this guy's style. It's got such a texture, a feel to it. It's not dead line inking. You're really giving it a sculpting almost. And I said, man, this guy's got something going on here. You know,
Yeah, you've been making
that's one of the reasons I
comments
like.
for a couple of years. So I think what happened was then in the feed you started popping up higher, and then I started seeing the Wrestler Zero, and then Jake and I got into this creator exchange, and I said, "Oh, what the heck, man? Let's see if Tony would come on board." And sure enough, here you are. So thanks again
I
for
still owe
coming
Jake.
on.
I still owe Jake and you some prints, and I owe Jake some comics. I haven't forgotten. Um, yeah, I mean, I
Oh,
love
that's
what you guys
okay.
are doing. I think I made a video. Uh, I think I spent about half the video talking about the 6-page Turbo
You
Pit
did.
Fighter
Thank you.
preview that you sent me. Yeah, and I love it, man. I mean, I am all over that. And when you guys print it, I want to buy 2 copies. I definitely want to give you my money.
Thank you.
I saw that video, and
Wow.
um, I got to talk to Kurt for a second. When I saw his video, I was like, "Oh no, we got to step up our game," because he was giving like this really in-depth like analysis of the artwork and the aesthetic, and I don't know if we're doing as much on our flip throughs when we're talking about the art. We're supposed to be the art teachers, right?
Well,
I
I've
don't
been
know.
able to, yeah.
Yes, but I think the bigger part of it is that it's this kind of roundtable conversation as art education goes, because you're actually leaning into, we're learning just as much from Tony as Tony's learning from us.
That's for sure. You know, in the video, and I just want to reiterate this, when I saw when I received the preview in the mail, I immediately had a flashback to my New York days when you had guys like Ken Landgraf out there doing like, Star Warriors, New York City Outlaws, and the comic book medium is large enough to accommodate any stylistic approach. But the work that you guys are doing, it just has such an energy to it, and and the look of the work, the aesthetic side of the work, completely fits the theme. Because you've got this strong character. There she is in this, fallen world, and she literally has to fight to survive. It's almost a little bit like sci-fi, almost like Spartacus, Road Warrior, where everything is kind of like run down a little bit, and people are, forced to, fight for their life. And I'm reading this, and I'm completely into it. I think making the protagonist a woman, that's a fantastic touch. It probably wouldn't have occurred to me. And just the way you guys are laying out the pages, the flow from, the way we read left to right. I was never confused. I never paused and said, "Oh, what are they trying to say here?" It was very clear. And one of the traps that's easy for us, people who draw in ink and stuff like that, to fall into is almost like we fall in love with the visual side of it. And comic books is really a storytelling medium. And I have to remind myself of this all of the time, where the art really shouldn't call that much attention to itself because it's just trying to convey a story. Because we've probably all read comics where the art was so beautiful that you're stopping and looking at the pictures. And you're not really
Right.
appreciating the story
Right.
as it's unfolding. And you guys managed to do both. I mean, I love your style, Jake. I mean, in the video, I said it reminds me a little bit of Don Simpson, Rick Veitch, that Ken Landgraf approach.
Hmm.
It's not purporting to be realistic. It's an interpretation of reality, and it's one that is completely in my wheelhouse because I grew up reading stuff like this, and I think that you can do realistic comics, and and I have nothing with that. I think there's some beautiful work being done in that, but I think with the approach that you're taking, it's more of a fantastic premise, and the art suits it. I mean, there's no two ways about it. And just the choice of angles, you're a lot bolder than I am. I need to get into more of the different angles that you guys use. But I mean, look at that shot there that, her punching that armored guy. The foreshortening you have there, the forms moving in and out of space. That's great stuff, man. I love it.
Thanks. Yeah, I don't know. I don't really think about it when when I'm looking at a blank page. I start out with the lollipop, which is like, the head and the
Yeah.
spine, and then, just keep adding on from there. But, there is this thing where you're squinting and you're trying to like take a movie out of your
Mhm.
mind and put it on the paper. So, it's a weird process, and it's a lot of fun to collaborate with somebody else and bring it through another layer, another set of hands and another
Yeah.
sensibility. But we do. I'm listening to everything you're saying because we do, very painstakingly like try to consider the reader experience. Not just the visuals, but the words and how it all goes together, the placement of everything, and leading the
Mhm.
eye. The conscious and the subliminal. So it's great to hear that some of the stuff is hitting
And that
home.
hand lettering, I have to give you props for that hand lettering because the look of the lettering fits the aesthetic of the story perfectly. Because if it was very neat, tidy, computer generated lettering, I think it would clash a little
Yep.
bit. But because, and I'm not knocking computer lettering, I mean, Lord knows. What I'm just merely saying is that in this instance, what you guys are doing, it perfectly matches the fallen world, rough and ready, rough and tumble aspect of
Yeah,
the
there's no
story. It's great.
distraction. There's no
No.
distraction in when you get to that. And that's, other than digital coloring, the digital lettering always just puts me off with a majority
Yeah.
of indie comics that I've come across, as well as the mainstream, especially if they're being produced in a computer. But then at the same time,
Mhm.
it's the question always comes about. Jake and I talk about it quite often. Is, well, if you're in the computer, then just do everything by hand. Why rely so
Exactly.
heavily on just using fonts to do sound effects and type it out? I mean, it's right there. Just knock it down and trace over it. If you have like really play with the
Mhm.
medium. But and
Yeah.
getting back to your Wrestler Zero, Tony. I mean,
Yeah.
it's hands down the first thing that came across to me is you're playing. You're playing with comic books as a love and passion. You're playing with materials.
Yeah.
You're figuring things out on the pages. So, you know, even leaning back into the outlaw comics and the black and white boom of 80s, you're really carrying with it that tradition of like, hey, if he can do it like this, why can't I do it my
Hmm.
way? And it just seems
Exactly.
to be a feed.
Yeah.
And it was one of the reasons Jake and I wanted to do this indie comic exchanges, because we tend to keep coming across people like through Instagram and YouTube, where we're going, whoa, wait a second, man, they're really putting everything into it. And let's talk about it. Let's have a little bit of a community, round the table
Sure.
chit chat about it.
Mhm. Well,
Yeah, you got on that spread. Well, you just left it, but that last spread, this spread too, like especially the left. But yeah, those blacks are just singing out, right? When
Yes.
you kind of squint at it, you see like there's this great balance and interplay, but you have these spot blacks that are leading the eye, and and it's like a beautiful visual language. And I'll tell you what seems similar to Relic Hunter is that you have this style that's like it's devil may care. It's like, okay, I'm not trying to be somebody else. I'm not trying to be realistic or cartooning. I'm just trying to, be expressive in my own style. And, that used
Be
to be,
me.
people used to look down
Yeah.
at that, but now I think there's a much greater appreciation for indie
Hmm.
comics, because things are so much like the same, and there's so much like duplicative, everything's so derivative from, from something else. Here's somebody that's just coming out of left field, pouring his heart and soul into it, and you get this style. It might remind you of some other things, but it also stands on its own. That's great. I see there's very minimal word balloons here. This is a great sequence here
But a
too.
lot of action.
It just speaks for itself.
Yeah, I'll tell you where a
Yeah.
lot of the black and white influence comes from, the spotting of blacks that you were pointing out earlier, is that while I was producing this comic, I had one of those TV VCR combos, and I had tons of VHS tapes, and I was playing like episodes of The Outer Limits, this British horror film called City of the Dead. It was brought to the United States as Horror Hotel, and strong black and white, beautiful aesthetics. And I would just look at that stuff and go, okay, that's the look that I like for this. And I just went with it. As far as influences go, I think at one time or another in my life, I've tried to be a bunch of different people. I've tried to draw like Bern Hogarth. I've tried to draw like Gil Kane. I've tried to even try to draw like Bruce Timm. Anyone I can get my little hands on, and I've learned something from each of those folks. But at the end of the day, I just said, look, I think I just want to be me, even if it's not a great
Hmm.
me, but it's me, it's me, and
I think it's a great
we
you.
all have influence. Thanks. Thank you very much. You're very kind. And we all have our influences, and it peeks through here and there in the work that we do. And that's great. There's nothing wrong with that because we're building on what came before, and then maybe subsequently someone will look at what one of us in the comic book, realm is doing and take some inspiration from
Absolutely.
that. And that's, I used to say to myself, you've become a real artist when someone swipes you. And I think I've only been swiped once, and so I think, okay, that gives me a little encouragement.
Well, just it over time, you'll see. It turns up on the dark web, and somebody's bootlegging it, or they got
Um,
a pay site, and it's one of a million other comics that are
you
on
know,
there. Unfortunately, there's nothing you can do
no, no,
about
it's
that.
okay. I
But
mean,
um,
look, I've given away a ton of stuff. I've given away a lot of copies of Wrestler Zero. That's why I'm down like to my last two copies. I've given a lot of stuff away. I've sold a lot of stuff, but I mean, I've handed people. As a matter of fact, I was just at a Lucha Libre show last year here in Las Vegas where I live, and I met this wrestler, and we struck up a pretty good acquaintance, and I ended up handing him two copies of issue 1 and 2 of Wrestler Zero, and I mean, so I've given stuff away, and I don't, it doesn't bother me if stuff shows up here and there. That's fine. I don't have a problem with it.
yeah, no, it's
Right,
what
right.
it's what I'm planning to do too. It's like it's
Yeah,
promotional, but we also are trying to get that long term
no doubt
follower.
about it.
It isn't just one and done, hopefully. And and if you give away the first one, maybe they come back and buy the
Exactly.
second one, or maybe they just watch your
Right.
podcast, or maybe they turn on a friend to
Mhm.
it,
Right,
but
right. Hey,
that's the thing. Those are the things that happen over time if you just stick with it.
And I know
so
Turbo Pit Fighters created as a comic book. I just wanted to add this. I forgot to mention this in the video, but I think that Turbo Pit Fighter is begging to be made into a movie or a high end series like the stuff you see on Amazon and stuff like that because you've got the classic elements in here. You've got science fiction, you've got an extremely strong female protagonist, you have this dystopian world, tons of action, that's waiting to that. I mean, if I were you guys, obviously I'm not telling you what to do, but if I were producing that, I would say I've got to get this and get myself an agent if I can and see if I can, have this shopped around because I mean, it's an extremely attractive premise, really is.
Yeah, thanks. When we have our first book in hand, we'll probably try any and
Mhm.
all things that we can do. I talked to Kurt about a lot, because when we're doing our podcast and we're drawing live, we have a lot of chit chat time. And we argue sometimes what is the epitome of being in the field. And it used to be, oh, I want to get a Marvel property, and be published by Marvel or DC, and and then have them put my work out. But no, I keep saying, to me anyway, the epitome of being in this field is to be like The Crow or The Walking Dead, or Men in Black, and just
Yeah.
have your comic picked out of obscurity and then turned into a Hollywood vehicle. There's pros and cons with that. You sell your soul, you get exploited, you give your stuff away. But, it's also, widening your reach, and it's validating that there's a story
Mhm.
there. There's a premise there. So we work really hard on that, and we're building this whole world of prequels and
So this
of
leads really well into the last question. So, Tony, what is the
Yeah.
future of comics?
I think the future of comics is going to be a lot of Kickstarters and Patreons, a lot of hustling. I know that when I published my first and second issue, I got in my car and I just drove to every comic book shop I could get my hands on and said, "Would you be willing to carry this for me? Would you be willing to sell this for me?" And I was very surprised and pleased by the fact that a lot of comic book shop owners have an interest in promoting local talent because a lot of the comic book shops that I go to, they have a
Yeah,
little
yeah.
section where they'll promote people, local guys who are doing work, and I think that's terrific. I've done three
yeah.
shows. I did the first two Rhode Island Comic Cons. I was living in Rhode Island at the time that I produced the Wrestler Zero comics. I did the first two Rhode Island Comic Cons, and I did a sort of toy and comic show in Massachusetts. And people really seemed to dig what I was doing. And so I think it's going to be a combination of self promotion, hustling, definitely a canny use of social media, YouTube, especially where people can see the product and they can hear you talk about it. I think that's where the future of comics is. I'm not sure what's going on with the mainstream right now. I'm not reading a ton of mainstream comics these days, unless it's by, someone whose work I'm really into. Um, so I don't
Mm,
get out to the comic book
right.
shop as much as I would like to. But I think that as far as Marvel and DC are concerned, at least, it just seems to me that the comics are continuing to be published as they are because it's basically very cheap R&D for them for making movies. But I think where they
Yep.
shoot themselves in the foot is
Yep.
that they don't put comics where children. Because I don't see comic books in supermarkets. I don't see them in department stores. I see them in libraries, but it's a lot of manga. The kids gravitate towards that because it's very accessible for them. And also because manga is very varied in its thematic approach. You have a lot of stuff that's tailored to young adults, young girls, and it's much more interesting for them. And I think one of the reasons that comic books were so ubiquitous when I was a boy is because they were everywhere. The comic books were available anywhere that a parent was spending
Yes,
money. There
very
was a
good.
comic book rack, a spinner rack there, and you're not seeing that now. And I don't know why. I'll give you a perfect example. There's an Avengers museum here in Las Vegas on the Strip of all places, but it's the Avengers movies. So I went in there just out of curiosity. Not one comic book to be found there, not one trade paperback. You would think that if they're
Huh.
selling the movie versions of these, that they would say, "Hey, by the way, this is where this came from," and they can put out a very cheap reprint of some material that doesn't require an encyclopedic knowledge of continuity that people like us have because we've been doing this our whole lives. And I don't see them doing that. And I think for me, the future is the use of social media, no question about it, Kickstarter, Patreon, and hustling, getting out there and getting your work into the shops, getting in front of people and doing small shows and just I've done teaching at libraries, for small kids, just very
Mhm.
basic fundamental stuff. They love it. And kids are extremely creative because comic books are still a medium that a child or a young person can create out of whole cloth. Because with video games,
Yeah.
it's all done for
Yeah.
you. You're the end user. And one thing that stunned me about these kids is that they would come into the class with these fully realized concepts. They had their whole little world mapped out, and I'm like, wow, maybe you should be teaching me. So yeah,
Yeah, I, I love to see that. I teach middle school, and I only wish more there was more kids. But every once in a while, you see a kid carrying around some, lined paper, and they're making some little characters on it. And I'm like, here's some unlined paper.
yeah, exactly. And
And and the sketchbooks, whatever you can give them. Sometimes I take 1117, fold it in half, and I use the stapler with the extra long arm on it, and I put some
yeah,
staples in the middle of it, and I give it to them, and they're like,
yeah,
"Wow, a comic book!" And I'm
yeah,
like, "Yep, it's all
exactly.
blank. All you got to do is make your thing
And
now."
I was teaching young kids, small kids, preteens. So the money that I was being paid by the library, I was turning around and reinvesting it into buying like the Adventures of Batman, Superman comics drawn in that Bruce Timm style, how to draw books,
Mm.
and I would hand these things out, give them to the kids, just to keep encouraging them. Because if you teach 20 kids in a class and two of them decide to pursue producing comics, that's a win in my book.
Oh
Yeah.
yeah,
So,
yeah. Yeah, it's usually 3 or 4 per
mhm.
100. In my experience, if you have a school and they have 400 kids, you're probably going to have like maybe five or
Yeah,
six kids that are into art, and then the rest are just passing through. But they can still appreciate
absolutely.
it.
And can we go back to
So
Turbo
on
Pit
the
Fighter for a
out.
second? Because it was something.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, hold on, Kurt. He had one more thing about
Yeah, what I
Turbo.
wanted to say was
Yep.
another thing that I think is so superb about your concept and its presentation, and I wish I would have thought about this when I made the video, is when I see a Batman movie, they try very hard to make it dramatic and make it look great, but at the end of the day, it's a grown guy running around in a bat costume. And they set it in a world that looks just like the one we live in. The 60s Batman TV show, the genius of that was that they set it in a world where it made perfect sense for the police commissioner to have a red phone and to call the Cape Crusader because it was a funhouse mirror version of our reality. And I think when you go too far with realism in comics, you kind of with superhero comics, I should say, you run the risk of revealing the absurd nature of them, if you know what I mean. They
Yeah,
work best on the
Yeah.
page
Yeah.
or maybe as good animated shows. But with Turbo Pit Fighter, that can translate beautifully into live action or very high-end animation because she's not running around wearing a bat costume. She's dressed in a manner that's there for her survival and her ability to fight. And plus it shows off her muscles. And I think that's great.
yeah. Thanks. Yeah, I think we're in a post superhero era where even when you do see superhero comics, a lot of these new series are now like making fun of them, like the
Yeah.
boys, or how ridiculous they were. I think maybe the Watchmen first started to like comment on how silly it was and how it was in the past, and some of these characters are corny when you look back, from the next generation. But they're still selling, so there's you got to put it in its place.
It's a place
There's definitely
There's a
a
place for
category.
it. I happen to love superheroes. I grew up reading superheroes. Occasionally, I will crack open, an old issue of Warlock by Roy Thomas and Gil Kane or something like that. Some Kurt Swan, Superman.
Yeah.
And I think that those heroes should be kept pure and innocent in a way. I don't want to see them get corrupted. On the other hand, I've seen, starting with Watchmen, as you pointed out, I think even before that, there was like The One by Rick Veitch. Um,
Uh-huh.
where yeah, the heroes have feet of clay. It's a deconstructionist approach, excuse me, to superheroes, sort of showing them with feet of clay and being flawed in some fundamental way. And I think that's perfectly valid. There's nothing wrong with that. My only concern with that would be that if it begins to eclipse the noble depiction of the hero. You know what I'm trying to say? The hero that does right because it's the right thing to do, kind of thing. You know. But there's room for
Yeah.
all manner of superhero story. You know, so it's all good.
Yeah, they've definitely looked at it from every
Yeah.
possible angle at this point, and there's a lot of
Yeah. Yeah.
reissues, reboots,
Yeah.
reimaginations. So it just goes on. But the thing that I think that Marvel is and DC are hurting themselves. Oh, I think we might have lost
Oh.
Kurt.
Oh no.
Is
Excuse me.
yeah, just give him a sec. I'm
Yeah, no
sure he'll
problem.
be back. Is that they're really oversaturating their own
Hmm.
markets, right? Like, why do you need five Batmans a month, five Spider-Mans a month?
Hmm.
It's just like it seems like it's really there's nothing
Yeah.
special about it, and it ending up in the dollar bin.
Well, you remember Nightfall, that whole Bane, breaking the Bat story? You had to buy so many comics that were not Batman. You had to
Yeah,
buy Catwoman, you had to buy Robin. And I'm like,
yeah,
I think,
the
yeah, crossover. And I
crossover.
think right around that time they were publishing Batman Adventures. It was drawn by the late Mike Parobeck, sort of in a Bruce Timmish
Uh
style.
huh.
And those comics were one and done. You got a complete story in one issue. So if you're a kid or you're a parent going to buy your kid a comic, what are you going to gravitate to? You're going to get the complete story in one issue, drawn in a very visually
Yeah.
accessible style. And you're absolutely correct. I agree with you. I mean, they've shot themselves in the foot with these endless crossovers and reboots, and you know,
Yeah, it seems like they're just throwing stuff at the wall, and and then it's okay to have nine flops if you have one hit, and then they'll take that and they'll
yeah,
repackage that in some
mhm,
prestige format or
mhm,
something. But yeah, it's like slow
yeah,
down there. I go to the comic store, and then to make matters even worse, you have all the variant
yeah,
covers now. And how ridiculous is that? Like, nobody's going to buy five issues of the
right,
same comic just because the covers are
exactly.
different. But but they're putting it out like people are. I don't know what the goal is at the end of the day, but this is something that Kurt and I wrestle with all the time.
Well, I mean, I think they're trying to. Depending on who you listen to or who you read, the mainstream comic book business, DC Marvel, is not really in great shape. So, and I think maybe some of that is still sort of the lingering fallout of the 90s speculator boom. Uh,
Hmm.
but I think they would do a lot better if they just went back to doing what they used to do, which is single part stories, maybe two issues at most, and not stop at all the rebooting and all of the, retro, fixing stuff retroactively and all that other stuff, and just focus on just telling some good stories. But more importantly, get comics in the hands of kids because they're selling to guys my age, and I think they really should be making a concerted effort to get comics where children are, because that's the next generation. If you want to continue on with that, you have to bring in a new generation of readers, and I don't think they've been very good at that. So,
Yeah, that's a good point. There's maybe like a 10-year cycle before you lost them, and so you want to
mhm.
start them out young and then hold on to them. So Kurt, we can't hear you right now. I guess you can hear us, but we can't hear you.
Kurt, I hope you're still out there, buddy.
So I'm just yeah, this happens sometimes. So I'm going to we're gonna have to close
Okay.
out here. We definitely want people to know. So Kurt will be linking to all of your links and socials in the bio and the description. But why don't you tell us where people can find you and make that part of the
Well, I'm
record?
on Instagram. It's at the Tony Figueroa. Uh, Same thing with Facebook, the Tony Figueroa, and I'm also on X under the same handle. Come check me out. I love to talk. I'm a talker. No doubt you've seen that already. So, by
Yeah.
all means, yeah, definitely. And I will continue to follow your work. And when you guys publish, I want to buy 2 copies.
Awesome. Thank you. Yeah. Thanks for the kind words and the encouragement. This is why we do it, and, back at you,
Thank
the
you.
same thing. We definitely want to follow your progress. We do plan to have our guests back on after a while and see what the
Okay.
latest is for all the updates. So tune in for that. And folks can check in our other channels, Making of Turbo Pit Fighter and Comics That Influence. For Kurt, this is Jake. Thanks a lot to Tony, and we'll see you guys next time.
Take care.